Number 10. The Golden State Killer, a case that haunted California for over 4 decades before genetic genealogy finally brought a monster to justice. In the mid-1970s, a masked intruder began terrorizing neighborhoods across Northern California with a methodical series of burglaries that escalated into sexual assaults, earning him the initial moniker of the East Area Rapist through his operational focus on the Sacramento suburbs. Between June 1976 and July 1979, this predator committed at least 50 confirmed sexual assaults, displaying chilling behavioral patterns that included stalking his victims for weeks beforehand, breaking into their homes to unlock windows and disable phone lines, and awakening sleeping couples by shining a flashlight in their eyes while wielding a gun. He would bind victims with intricate knot patterns using pre-cut lengths of ligature, stack dishes on the male victim's back as a crude alarm system to detect movement, and then proceed with prolonged sexual violence against the female victim, occasionally pausing to raid the refrigerator for food and beer, leaving behind taunting phone calls and creepy poems that investigators would later analyze for psychological insight. In 1979, the attack suddenly shifted southward to Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties, where the perpetrator escalated to murder, killing 10 people in a series of brutal home invasion slayings that earned him the additional nickname of the original Night Stalker, a distinction necessary until Richard Ramirez later claimed the simplified version. The murders followed a similar pattern to the earlier rapes, but with lethal finality, the killer often bludgeoning victims with objects taken from their own homes, a signature that connected the geographically distant crime scenes through forensic analysis that would prove crucial decades later. Despite comprehensive task forces, massive manhunts involving hundreds of law enforcement officers, composite sketches that bore only passing resemblance to the actual perpetrator, and a $50,000 reward offered by the FBI, the case began to grow cold as the attacks ceased mysteriously in 1986, leaving investigators to speculate whether the killer had died, been imprisoned for other crimes, or simply aged out of his violent compulsions. The breakthrough that would eventually crack this case emerged not from traditional detective work but from the revolutionary application of genetic genealogy, a technique that had not existed when the crimes were committed. In 2018, investigators led by Sacramento District Attorney and Marie Schubert and cold case detective Paul Holes uploaded crime scene DNA from a Ventura County double murder to the public genealogy database GEDmatch, identifying distant relatives of the unknown suspect among the site's users who had voluntarily uploaded their genetic information for ancestry research purposes. Working backward through family trees, a team of 5 genealogists constructed a network of potential ancestors, narrowing the search through methodical elimination based on age, location, and physical characteristics until they identified 72-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer who had worked in Exeter and Auburn during the periods when the East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker attacks were occurring in those respective regions. The revelation that the killer had been hiding in plain sight as a law enforcement officer sent shockwaves through the true crime community, and the surviving victims who had long suspected the sophisticated evasion techniques indicated police training. Surveillance teams covertly collected discarded DNA from D'Angelo's trash and car door handle, obtaining a direct match to the semen and blood left at multiple crime scenes with astronomical statistical certainty. On April 24, 2018, FBI agents and local police executed a tactical arrest outside D'Angelo's suburban Sacramento home, finding an elderly man who appeared remarkably ordinary despite the extraordinary violence of his past. Though investigators noted his aggressive resistance during the booking process hinted at the rage that had fueled decades of atrocities. During interrogation, D'Angelo initially denied all allegations, but investigators employed psychological tactics developed specifically for this capture, mentioning topics like his ex-fiancée Bonnie Jean Collette, which triggered an audible emotional response suggesting the rejected marriage proposal may have catalyzed his violent spree, and discussing his daughters and grandchildren, at which point D'Angelo reportedly wheeled his wheelchair into a corner and whispered to himself, "I did all that," though he would later plead not guilty before ultimately accepting a comprehensive plea deal that avoided the death penalty. On June 29, 2020, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to numerous uncharged crimes including the rapes and burglaries, standing in a wheelchair before multiple judges representing the various jurisdictions where he had wreaked havoc and offering a raspy guilty, and "I admit" to each charge as survivors and family members watched remotely due to COVID-19 restrictions. their faces displaying the complex emotions of 4 decades of waiting finally, yielding accountability. The sentencing phase featured 3 days of victim impact statements from over 150 individuals affected by the crimes, including survivors who described the lasting psychological trauma of waking to find a masked gunman in their bedroom, children who grew up without murdered parents, and investigators who had spent careers chasing ghosts before finally witnessing resolution. On August 21, 2020, Judge Michael Bowman sentenced D'Angelo to 11 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, plus an additional life sentence and enhancements, declaring that the defendant deserved no mercy while acknowledging that the sentence could never fully capture the magnitude of suffering inflicted across multiple generations of victims. The Golden State Killer case fundamentally transformed forensic investigation, establishing genetic genealogy as a standard cold case tool that has since solved hundreds of previously unsolvable crimes, though it also sparked crucial debates about genetic privacy and the balance between public safety and civil liberties in an era of commodified DNA. For the women who survived the East Area Rapists attacks and the families of those murdered by the original Night Stalker, the resolution provided imperfect closure, the decades of uncertainty having already shaped lives through hypervigilance, broken relationships, and pervasive fear that no sentence could fully repair, though many expressed profound relief that their attacker would die in prison and that their cooperation with law enforcement, their willingness to submit to intimate evidence, collection and relive trauma through interviews, had ultimately contributed to preventing future victimization by a predator who might never have stopped seeking new targets. Number 9. The 1984 murder of Claire Hoff, a 14-year-old San Diego girl whose case remained unsolved for 3 decades until DNA evidence linked a convicted killer already serving a life sentence for a separate murder. On August 24, 1984, Claire Hoff had traveled from her home in San Jose to visit her grandparents in San Diego, a routine summer trip that should have involved beach days and family dinners, but instead ended in tragedy when she went to Torrey Pines State Beach alone during the afternoon and never returned. Her grandparents reported her missing that evening, triggering an immediate search that located her body the following morning in a secluded area of the beach park, where investigators determined she had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death, the violence of the attack suggesting a perpetrator with significant rage and possibly prior experience in such crimes. The initial investigation generated several suspects, including a local man who had been seen near the beach that day and a transient population that frequented the area. But without the benefit of modern DNA analysis, detectives could not definitively link any individual to the biological evidence recovered from Claire's body, and the case gradually went cold despite periodic reviews by successive generations of San Diego homicide detectives who refused to let the file gather dust completely. In 2008, the San Diego Police Department's Cold Case Unit, established specifically to apply emerging forensic technologies to unsolved homicides, resubmitted the evidence for DNA analysis using methods far more sensitive than those available in 1984, successfully developing a complete male DNA profile from semen found on Claire's body that did not match any known suspect from the original investigation, nor any profile in the Cody's database at that time. The case remained stagnant for another 6 years until 2014, when a routine database search, conducted as part of an expanding effort to re-examine cold cases with new DNA technology, produced a shocking match to Ronald Clyde Porter, a 62-year-old inmate already incarcerated at Centinela State Prison, serving a life sentence plus 4 years for the 1986 murder of Jennifer S. Benson, a 21-year-old Palm Desert woman whom Porter had kidnapped, assaulted, and attempted to kill by running over her with his car, though S. Benson miraculously survived to testify against him. Investigators immediately recognized the significance of this development, realizing that Claire Hoff's murder had occurred during the 2-year window between Porter's release from a Florida prison in 1982, where he had served time for armed robbery and assault, and his capture for the S. Benson attack, a period during which police now suspected he may have committed additional violent crimes that had never been connected to him. Detectives conducted a thorough review of Porter's movements during the summer of 1984, establishing that he had indeed been living in the San Diego area, working various temporary jobs, and frequenting the beaches where he would have encountered Claire Hoff, though he had never been considered a suspect in the original investigation despite his extensive criminal history because his record in Florida had not triggered alerts in California databases at that time. In February 2014, cold case detectives traveled to Centinela State Prison to interview Porter, who initially denied any knowledge of Claire Hoff or the Torrey Pines murder. maintaining the same denials he had offered regarding Jennifer Espenson until confronted with the irrefutable DNA evidence that placed him at the crime scene with scientific certainty of 1 in 1.1 trillion. Faced with this biological proof, Porter's demeanor shifted and he eventually provided a detailed confession, admitting that he had encountered Claire at the beach, initiated a conversation with the trusting teenager, and then lured her to a secluded area where he attacked her, though he attempted to minimize his culpability by claiming the stabbing occurred during a struggle rather than as a deliberate act of violence, a characterization contradicted by the forensic evidence showing multiple defensive wounds on Claire's hands and arms indicating she had fought desperately for her life. The confession provided Claire's family with answers they had sought for nearly 30 years, though the resolution brought complicated emotions as they learned the details of their daughter's final hours and the random, opportunistic nature of her death at the hands of a predator who selected victims based on vulnerability and circumstance rather than personal connection. In March 2014, the San Diego District Attorney's Office filed murder charges against Porter, who was transported from state prison to county jail to await trial, a proceeding that moved relatively quickly given the strength of the DNA evidence and the confession obtained by investigators. During plea negotiations, prosecutors offered Porter a sentence of 25 years to life to run concurrent with his existing sentence, recognizing that a trial would provide little additional benefit given his already permanent incarceration while sparing Claire's family the trauma of testifying about their decades of grief. On September 12, 2014, Porter pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, facing Claire's mother and other family members in the courtroom and offering no statement of remorse, though the judge took the opportunity to deliver a blistering condemnation of Porter's predatory history and the devastation he had caused across multiple states and decades. The case highlighted both the promise and limitations of DNA cold case work, demonstrating that scientific advances could identify perpetrators years after crimes were committed, but could not fully heal the wounds inflicted on families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Nor could it restore the lives cut short by violence. For the San Diego Police Department, the resolution represented a validation of their commitment to cold case investigation and the importance of preserving physical evidence despite technological limitations at the time of collection, a practice that has since become standard but was not guaranteed in the 1980s when storage space and costs sometimes led to evidence destruction. Claire Hoff's murder also contributed to evolving discussions about juvenile safety and stranger danger awareness, though her case specifically illustrated the difficulty of protecting teenagers from opportunistic predators in public spaces, a challenge that persists despite technological advances in surveillance and communication. Today, Ronald Porter remains incarcerated, his earliest possible parole date long after his expected death, while Claire Hoff is remembered by her family as a vibrant young woman with artistic talents and a kind heart. Her legacy now including a cautionary tale about the importance of preserving hope in cold cases and the scientific progress that can finally bring long-delayed justice. Number 8. The 1975 murder of Martha McKay, a beloved Arkansas teacher whose killing remained unsolved for 40 years until DNA evidence identified a suspect who had died decades earlier, illustrating how genetic genealogy can solve cases even when perpetrators escape earthly justice. On December 17, 1975, 46-year-old Martha McKay failed to appear for her teaching duties at Little Rock Central High School, prompting concerned colleagues to contact her family, who discovered her body in her ransacked home in the Pulaski Heights neighborhood, where investigators determined she had been sexually assaulted and strangled in a violent attack that showed signs of prolonged struggle, suggesting she had fought her attacker with considerable force before succumbing. The initial investigation focused on several suspects, including a former handyman who had done work at McKay's home and a series of burglars active in the upscale neighborhood. But despite extensive interviews and polygraph examinations that were standard procedure at the time, detectives could not develop sufficient evidence to charge any individual, and the case gradually joined the hundreds of unsolved homicides accumulating in Arkansas during the 1970s, a decade of rising violent crime that strained investigative resources. Biological evidence collected from the scene, including semen samples and skin cells from under McKay's fingernails where she had apparently scratched her attacker, was preserved in the state crime laboratory, though the technology of the time could only perform basic blood typing that excluded some suspects but could not identify the perpetrator with the specificity that would come with DNA profiling 2 decades later. The case received periodic media attention on anniversaries of the murder, with McKay's family maintaining pressure on law enforcement to continue investigating and her former students organizing memorials that emphasized her dedication to education and the tragic waste of her murder. Though as years turned to decades, hope of resolution faded even among those most committed to finding justice. In 2015, the Little Rock Police Department Cold Case Unit, in collaboration with the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory, resubmitted the biological evidence for advanced DNA analysis, successfully developing a complete genetic profile from the original samples despite their 40-year age, and uploaded this profile to Cody's where it produced no immediate matches, as the unknown killer had apparently never been arrested for a felony following the murder and thus had no DNA on file. The breakthrough came in 2019 when investigators partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based forensic technology company that had pioneered the use of genetic genealogy for law enforcement applications, creating a genetic profile suitable for comparison with public genealogy databases where users upload their DNA information to research family histories. Genetic genealogists working on the case constructed a family tree from distant relatives who appeared in the database, methodically tracing branches backward through generations to identify common ancestors and then forward through time to identify potential suspects who would have been alive and in Arkansas during 1975, a process that required comparing census records, obituaries, marriage licenses, and other genealogical documents to narrow the field. This painstaking work eventually identified Jack O'Neill, a former insurance salesman who had lived in Little Rock during the 1970s and died in 1997 at age 65 from heart disease, never having been considered a suspect in the original investigation despite having sold a policy to McKay several years before her death, a connection that had not raised red flags during the initial inquiry because there was no indication of inappropriate behavior at that time. Investigators located O'Neill's surviving children and obtained voluntary DNA samples confirming the genetic relationship to the crime scene evidence with statistical certainty exceeding 99.9%, effectively closing the case despite the perpetrator's death, though the lack of a living defendant complicated the question of how to formally resolve the matter in the criminal justice system. The Little Rock Police Department held a press conference in November 2019 announcing the resolution, with Chief Keith Humphrey acknowledging both the satisfaction of finally providing answers to McKay's family and the frustration that O'Neill would never face trial or account for his actions, a common outcome in cold cases solved through genetic genealogy where perpetrators are often identified only after their natural deaths. For McKay's surviving relatives, including nieces and nephews who had been children when she was killed, the identification brought mixed emotions, a sense of closure in knowing what had happened and who was responsible, tempered by the knowledge that the killer had lived out his natural life without consequence, dying peacefully while their aunt had been robbed of 35 years of existence. The case demonstrated the particular challenges of deceased perpetrator identification, requiring law enforcement to develop new protocols for officially closing cases without judicial proceedings, and sparking debates about whether to publicly name dead suspects given the impossibility of legal defense or cross-examination, though most agencies have adopted transparency as the default position given the public interest in accountability even posthumously. Martha McKay's murder also highlighted the importance of evidence preservation, as the samples that yielded the genetic breakthrough had survived 4 decades of storage, multiple laboratory relocations, and budget pressures that sometimes lead to evidence destruction, a preservation that many cold case investigators credit to the meticulous record-keeping of the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory. The resolution inspired renewed interest in other Arkansas cold cases from the 1970s, with several additional investigations leveraging genetic genealogy to identify suspects in previously unsolved homicides, creating a momentum that has continued to yield results in subsequent years. Today, Martha McKay is remembered through a scholarship fund established by her former students at Little Rock Central High School, honoring her 30-year teaching career and the thousands of lives she touched, while her murder stands as a testament to the persistence required in cold case investigation and the technological advances that can finally provide answers when human determination refuses to abandon the search for truth. Number 7. The 1986 murder of Michelle Welch, a 12-year-old Tacoma girl whose case remained unsolved for over 3 decades until genetic genealogy identified a perpetrator who had lived in the same neighborhood, passing unnoticed through the community he had devastated. On March 26, 1986, Michelle Welch took her 2 younger sisters to Puget Park in Tacoma's North End, a wooded area with trails and a playground where local children frequently played, the girls intending to spend the morning exploring while their mother worked nearby, planning to meet for lunch at a designated time. When Michela's mother arrived at the appointed location, she found only the younger sisters, who explained that Michela had gone to look for a better restroom facility and never returned, triggering an immediate search by family and park visitors that expanded to include police and hundreds of volunteers as the hours passed without finding the missing girl. That evening, a search dog located Michela's body in a gully approximately 400 yards from the playground, where investigators determined she had been sexually assaulted and killed by blunt force trauma to the head, the attack occurring in a secluded area where her screams would have been muffled by the dense forest cover that characterized the park. The initial investigation developed several suspects, including local sex offenders and a transient population that camped in the wooded areas. But despite extensive interviews, polygraph tests, and the collection of biological evidence, detectives could not identify the perpetrator. And the case gradually went cold as leads dried up and resources were redirected to more recent crimes, though Michela's mother, Barbara Welch, refused to let her daughter's murder be forgotten, maintaining contact with detectives and organizing community remembrance events that kept the case visible. The case broke in 2018 when Tacoma Police Department detectives, working with the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory, submitted the biological evidence for genetic genealogy analysis after the success of the Golden State Killer investigation demonstrated the technique's potential for previously unsolvable cases. Parabon Nanolabs constructed a family tree from distant relatives in Geed Match, narrowing to Gary Charles Hartman, a 66-year-old man who had lived within 2 miles of Puget Park in 1986, worked as a nurse at a local hospital, and had no prior criminal record that would have brought him to investigators' attention during the original inquiry. Surveillance teams collected discarded DNA from a napkin Hartman used at a restaurant, confirming the match to crime scene evidence with astronomical statistical certainty. And on June 20, 2018, detectives arrested Hartman at his home in the same neighborhood where he had lived for decades, apparently living an unremarkable life while harboring the secret of Michela's murder. The arrest shocked neighbors who knew Hartman as a quiet, professional man, though subsequent investigation revealed that he had been arrested in 1982 for raping a 16-year-old girl, a charge reduced to assault through plea bargaining that resulted in probation and no requirement to register as a sex offender, information that neither appeared in databases accessible to 1986 investigators nor connected him to Michela's murder despite the geographical proximity and similar victimology. During interrogation, Hartman maintained his innocence, offering alternative explanations for the DNA evidence and refusing to provide any information about the day of the murder, though investigators noted his detailed knowledge of the park layout and his immediate interest in whether they had found fingerprints at the scene, a question that suggested consciousness of guilt. The trial, delayed by multiple motions regarding genetic genealogy privacy concerns and the COVID-19 pandemic, finally commenced in March 2022, featuring testimony from genetic genealogists explaining their methodology, forensic scientists discussing the DNA match, and emotional testimony from Barbara Welch describing 36 years of waiting for justice. On March 23, 2022, a jury convicted Hartman of first-degree murder and first-degree rape, rejecting defense arguments that the genetic genealogy evidence was unreliable and that the DNA could have been transferred innocently, a verdict that brought Barbara Welch to tears as she later addressed reporters, expressing gratitude that she had lived to see accountability for her daughter's killer. Hartman was sentenced to 36 years to life in prison, the judge specifically noting the decades of suffering inflicted on the Welch family through the killer's concealment. While the case contributed to ongoing legal debates about the admissibility of genetic genealogy evidence and the privacy implications of third-party DNA sharing that continue to evolve through appellate review. For the Tacoma Police Department, the resolution represented validation of their commitment to cold case investigation and their willingness to adopt emerging technologies. While for the wider community, Michela's murder remains a cautionary tale about the limits of neighborhood safety and the hidden predators who may live among us for decades without detection. Number 6. The 1957 murder of Maria Ridolph, one of America's oldest cold cases to result in a conviction, demonstrating that even crimes committed before modern forensic science existed can yield to persistent investigation and legal innovation. On December 3, 1957, 7-year-old Maria Ridolph disappeared from the street near her home in Sycamore, Illinois, a small farming community where violent crime was virtually unknown and children played unsupervised without parental concern. Maria having gone outside after dinner to play in the snow with her 8-year-old friend Kathy Sigmund. The girls were approached by a young man who called himself Johnny and offered Maria a piggyback ride, a seemingly innocent interaction in an era before stranger danger education, after which Kathy ran home to fetch a doll she wanted to show, returning minutes later to find both Maria and the man vanished without trace, triggering a massive search involving thousands of volunteers, the Illinois National Guard, and national media attention that made Maria's disappearance one of the most infamous missing child cases of the 1950s. 5 months later, Maria's body was discovered in a wooded area approximately 100 miles away in Joe Daviess County, where an autopsy determined she had been stabbed multiple times and sexually assaulted, though the advanced decomposition complicated precise determination of the cause and timeline, and the case remained unsolved despite extensive investigation that included tracking down hundreds of men named Johnny or fitting the description provided by Kathy Sigmund, who, despite her youth, provided investigators with remarkably detailed observations about the suspect's appearance and clothing. The case might have remained forever unsolved except for the persistence of Illinois State Police Detective Lieutenant Patrick Soler, who reopened the investigation in 2008 after discovering that Kathy Sigmund, by then an adult grandmother, had consistently maintained her identification of the suspect and was willing to cooperate with renewed efforts to find Maria's killer. Soler's review of the original case files identified Jack Daniel McCullough, formerly John Tessier, as a potential suspect, a man who had lived in Sycamore in 1957 and matched the description provided by Sigmund, though he had been cleared in the original investigation when his parents provided an alibi claiming he had been in Chicago for military physical examinations on the day of the abduction. McCullough had subsequently relocated to Seattle, served 20 years as a police officer, and retired to a nursing home in Washington state, apparently living an unremarkable life while the Ridolph case haunted Sycamore's collective memory. Soler's renewed investigation uncovered crucial contradictions in McCullough's 1957 alibi, discovering that military records showed his physical examination had occurred the day after Maria's disappearance, and locating a collect phone call McCullough had made to his parents from Sycamore on the evening of December 3rd, directly contradicting their claim that he had been in Chicago all day. In 2011, authorities exhumed Maria's body seeking DNA evidence, though the 54-year-old remains yielded no usable biological material given the state of preservation technology at the time of her initial burial, forcing prosecutors to build a circumstantial case based on the alibi discrepancy, Sigmund's identification, and statements from McCullough's half-sisters who recalled him arriving home on December 3, 1957, with blood on his clothing and making incriminating comments about Maria, that they had kept secret for decades out of family loyalty. The trial, held in 2012, featured testimony from Kathy Sigmund, who at 63 made an in-court identification of McCullough as the man she had known as Johnny, despite the 55-year interval and defense arguments that such an identification was inherently unreliable given her age at the time of the original observation and the suggestive nature of subsequent media exposure to McCullough's photograph. On September 14, 2012, a jury convicted McCullough of murder, kidnapping, and abduction of a child, sentencing him to life in prison, making Maria Ridolph's case the oldest solved cold case in American history to result in a conviction, a milestone that generated extensive media coverage and renewed interest in other decades-old child murders. The conviction was not without controversy, as McCullough maintained his innocence through multiple appeals, and some legal commentators questioned whether a conviction based primarily on a childhood memory and family testimony, without physical evidence, could be considered reliable after more than half a century, though appellate courts consistently upheld the verdict. In 2016, the Illinois Appellate Court ordered a new trial based on arguments that the prosecution had improperly excluded evidence supporting McCullough's alibi, but the Illinois Supreme Court reversed this decision in 2017, reinstating the conviction and closing McCullough's legal avenues for relief, though he died in prison in 2020 maintaining his innocence. For the Ridolph family, particularly Maria's surviving brother Charles, who had been 12 when his sister disappeared and who dedicated his retirement to pursuing justice, the conviction provided a measure of closure despite the decades that had passed. Though Charles Ridolph acknowledged that no legal outcome could restore what had been taken from his family and community, the case established important precedents for prosecuting ancient crimes, demonstrating that circumstantial evidence, properly developed and presented, could meet the burden of proof even without forensic confirmation, while also highlighting the ethical complexities of prosecuting elderly defendants for crimes committed in their youth and the challenges of mounting a defense when witnesses have died and records have been destroyed by the passage of time. Maria Ridolfi's murder remains a defining trauma for Sycamore, Illinois, where a memorial stands near the site of her abduction, and her case continues to be studied by law enforcement as an example of how cold case investigation can succeed through institutional persistence and the willingness of witnesses to come forward with information they may have withheld for decades. Number 5. The 1993 murder of Sophie Sergi, a 20-year-old Alaska Native woman whose killing remained unsolved for 25 years until a suspect's DNA, collected for an unrelated crime, finally matched evidence preserved from the brutal attack at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. On April 26, 1993, Sophie Sergi had traveled from her home in Pitcairn Point to Fairbanks to visit friends and undergo medical consultations, staying in a dormitory at the University of Alaska Fairbanks where her friend was a student, planning to return to her rural village after resolving health concerns that had brought her to the urban center. During the night, another resident of the dormitory discovered a fire in the second-floor bathroom, and when maintenance workers responded to extinguish the flames, they found Sophie Sergi's body in the bathtub, where she had been sexually assaulted, stabbed multiple times, and shot in the back of the head in an extraordinarily violent attack that suggested significant rage and possibly prior experience in such crimes. The fire apparently set in an unsuccessful attempt to destroy evidence. The investigation immediately faced significant challenges, including the transient nature of the dormitory population, with students coming and going at all hours making timeline construction difficult, and the harsh Alaska environment that complicated forensic evidence collection. Though investigators successfully developed a complete male DNA profile from semen and skin cells recovered from Sophie's body and the crime scene, a significant achievement given the technology of the early 1990s. Despite extensive interviews with hundreds of individuals, including every male resident of the dormitory and numerous persons of interest developed through behavioral analysis, the DNA profile produced no matches in emerging databases, and the case gradually went cold as leads exhausted and investigators transferred to other assignments, though the Alaska State Troopers maintained the evidence and periodically resubmitted the DNA profile as database expansion brought new possibilities for matching. The breakthrough came in 2018 when the DNA profile, submitted to a comprehensive search of expanded databases, produced a familial match to Stephen Harris Downs, a 44-year-old nurse working in Auburn, Maine, whose DNA had been collected following a 2016 DUI arrest and entered into the system, the match indicating he was likely a close relative of the unknown perpetrator. Further investigation revealed that Downs had been a freshman at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in 1993, living in the same dormitory where Sophie Sergi was murdered, though he had never been interviewed during the original investigation because he had moved out of the dormitory shortly after the murder and left Alaska entirely, his departure not raising suspicion at the time because many students left during the summer break. Investigators obtained a court order for a direct DNA sample from Downs, confirming with certainty of 1 in hundreds of billions that his DNA matched the crime scene evidence, and in February 2019, Maine State Police arrested Downs at his home, extraditing him to Alaska to face murder and sexual assault charges that carried potential sentences of up to 129 years given the multiple offenses and their violent nature. The trial, conducted in 2022 after pandemic-related delays, featured extensive forensic testimony regarding the DNA evidence and its statistical significance. Testimony from dormitory residents who recalled the atmosphere of fear following the murder, and emotional statements from Sophie Sergi's family describing the devastation her death had caused in their tight-knit Yupik community, where violent crime was rare and her promising future had represented hope for generational advancement. On February 10, 2022, a jury convicted Downs of first-degree murder and first-degree sexual assault, rejecting defense arguments that the DNA evidence could have been contaminated or planted, though no evidence supported such claims, and the judge sentenced him to 99 years in prison, effectively ensuring he would die in custody regardless of appellate outcomes. The case highlighted both the power of DNA database expansion in solving cold cases and the particular vulnerabilities of Alaska Native women, who experience disproportionate rates of violence and whose cases have historically received less media and investigative attention than those of white victims, a disparity that Sophie Sergi's family and advocates emphasized throughout the proceedings. For the Alaska State Troopers, The resolution represented a validation of their decades-long commitment to the case and their preservation of evidence through multiple laboratory relocations and budget crises. While for the University of Alaska Fairbanks community, the conviction brought closure to a trauma that had haunted the campus for a generation, with a memorial garden established in Sophie Sergi's honor. The case also illustrated the geographic mobility of both perpetrators and investigators in cold case work, with a murder committed in Alaska solved through an arrest in Maine, demonstrating the national and increasingly international scope of forensic cooperation that has become essential to modern law enforcement. Sophie Sergi's murder remains a touchstone for discussions of violence against Indigenous women, her case cited by advocates pressing for improved law enforcement response and media coverage of missing and murdered Indigenous persons, while her family's persistence in maintaining contact with investigators and their willingness to participate in renewed publicity efforts contributed significantly to the case remaining active long enough for DNA technology to provide the definitive answer they had sought for 25 years. Number 4. The 1984 murder of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce, known as the Bedsit murders, two young women killed in Kent, England, whose case remained unsolved for more than 3 decades until DNA evidence linked a man who had been interviewed during the original investigation but never considered a serious suspect. In June and November 1987, respectively, 25-year-old Wendy Nell and 20-year-old Caroline Pierce were found murdered in their ground-floor Bedsit apartments in Tunbridge Wells and Raynham, Kent, both women having been sexually assaulted and killed by blunt force trauma to the head in attacks that occurred in their own homes, where they lived alone in the vulnerable housing type that characterized Bedsit accommodation prevalent among young single women in 1980s Britain. The similarities between the cases, including the method of entry through insecure ground-floor windows, the sexual nature of the attacks, the use of objects from the victims' homes as weapons, and the post-mortem concealment of bodies, immediately suggested a single perpetrator, though forensic capabilities of the time could only establish blood type and basic serological markers rather than the individual identification that DNA profiling would later provide. The investigation, at the time the largest in Kent police history, identified numerous suspects through geographic profiling and victimology analysis, including David Fuller, a 33-year-old hospital electrician who lived in the area and had been arrested in 1985 for a series of burglaries targeting women's underwear, though he was eliminated from serious consideration when his blood type did not match evidence from the crime scenes, a conclusion that would prove erroneous due to the limited discriminatory power of abiotyping compared to DNA analysis. The case gradually went cold despite periodic reviews and the continued emotional impact on the victims' families, particularly Wendy Nell's mother, who maintained contact with detectives and preserved her daughter's belongings in the hope that advancing technology would eventually identify the killer, a vigil that would extend across 3 decades of scientific and investigative evolution. The resolution came in 2019 when Kent Police, participating in a national program to apply advanced DNA technology to historic murder cases, submitted the biological evidence for comprehensive analysis using methods that could extract usable genetic material from degraded samples that had defeated earlier attempts. When the complete DNA profile was developed and uploaded to the United Kingdom's National DNA Database, it produced an immediate match to David Fuller, whose DNA had been collected following a 2015 arrest for a minor offense and retained in the expanding database that had not existed when the murders were committed. The implications of this match were immediately apparent to investigators. Fuller had been interviewed in 1987, eliminated based on faulty blood typing, and had lived in the community for 33 years since the murders, working consistently at the same hospital, raising a family, and presenting an unremarkable facade while concealing his identity as a double murderer and, as subsequent investigation would reveal, a prolific necrophiliac who had abused at least 101 corpses in hospital mortuaries where his maintenance position provided unsupervised access. Fuller was arrested in December 2020. His home searched, revealing extensive trophy collections including photographs of his mortuary abuses and items taken from the 1987 victims that he had preserved for 33 years, a degree of compulsion that explained his inability to fully conceal his crimes despite decades of apparent normalcy. During interrogation, Fuller offered no explanation for the DNA evidence, maintaining silence until presented with overwhelming proof, at which point he provided limited admissions regarding the 1987 murders while offering various excuses for his mortuary abuses, including claims of undiagnosed mental health conditions that experts rejected as insufficient to explain the organized, sustained nature of his offending. On December 15, 2021, Fuller pleaded guilty to the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce, and to extensive charges related to his mortuary offenses, receiving 2 whole-life orders ensuring he would never be released, a sentence reserved for the most serious offenders in the British justice system. The case generated extraordinary public reaction due to the revelation of Fuller's mortuary abuses, prompting immediate reviews of hospital security procedures and mortuary access protocols nationwide, while raising complex questions about how someone could commit such extensive crimes over 15 years without detection despite working in a regulated healthcare environment. For the families of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce, the resolution brought answers they had sought for 34 years, though the additional revelations about Fuller's subsequent offending added layers of horror to their understanding of the man who had murdered their daughters, and they advocated for stronger safeguards against similar offenders infiltrating positions of trust. The Bedsit murders case demonstrated the particular effectiveness of DNA database expansion in solving historical crimes in the United Kingdom, where national database coverage and cold case review programs have achieved remarkable success rates, while also illustrating how elimination of suspects based on limited forensic testing can derail investigations for decades, a caution that has influenced contemporary investigative protocols requiring comprehensive DNA analysis even when preliminary testing appears to exclude individuals. David Fuller's case remains one of the most disturbing in British criminal history. His ability to function in normal society while harboring such extraordinary deviance challenging assumptions about the detectability of dangerous offenders and the adequacy of screening procedures for positions involving vulnerable individuals, whether living or deceased. Number 3. The 1975 murder of Martha Moxley, a 15-year-old girl beaten to death with a golf club in the exclusive Greenwich, Connecticut community of Belle Haven, a case that languished for 23 years before a renewed investigation focused on a neighbor whose family connections had initially shielded him from serious scrutiny. On the night of October 30, 1975, Martha Moxley attended an early Halloween gathering with friends in her gated community, leaving with a group that included 17-year-old Michael Skakel and his older brother Thomas, members of the Skakel family whose wealth, derived from their ownership of Great Lakes Carbon Corporation, and relation to the Kennedy family through Ethel Skakel Kennedy, made them prominent figures in local society. Martha was last seen alive near the Skakel residence around 9:30 p.m. Her body discovered the following afternoon beneath a tree on her family's property, where she had been struck multiple times with a 6-iron golf club owned by the Skakel family. The blows so forceful that the club's shaft had shattered, with one piece used to stab her through the neck in a post-mortem attack suggesting extraordinary rage or ritualistic elements. The initial investigation immediately encountered obstacles including the Skakel family's refusal to cooperate fully, their retention of influential attorneys, and the reluctance of Greenwich police to aggressively pursue suspects from such a prominent family. Though Thomas Skakel was considered a prime suspect based on his presence with Martha shortly before her death and inconsistent statements about his whereabouts that evening. The case gradually went cold despite occasional reinvestigations, the Moxley family's continued advocacy, and multiple books and articles that kept public attention focused on the unsolved murder, with the Skakel family's wealth and connections frequently cited as explanations for the failure to achieve resolution, though prosecutors maintained that insufficient evidence rather than political pressure had prevented charges. The breakthrough came in 1998 when Connecticut State's Attorney Jonathan Benedict, responding to continuing pressure from the Moxley family and new information developed by journalist Leonard Levitt and private investigator Vito Colucci, impaneled a one-judge grand jury with subpoena powers to compel testimony from witnesses who had previously refused to cooperate, including the Skakel brothers and other individuals present on the night of the murder. This proceeding uncovered critical evidence including statements Michael Skakel had made to participants in a residential substance abuse treatment program in the 1980s, where he reportedly confessed to killing Martha in a panic after she rejected his sexual advances, describing details of the crime that had not been publicly disclosed and suggesting a level of knowledge inconsistent with innocence. Additional witnesses described Michael's obsession with Martha, his jealousy of her relationships with other boys, and his erratic behavior on the night of the murder, including his location outside her window and his subsequent attempts to divert suspicion toward a family tutor who had been present in the Skakel home. Based on this evidence, Michael Skakel was arrested on January 19, 2000, charged with murder as a juvenile because he had been 17 at the time of the offense, though he would be tried as an adult with potential penalties including life imprisonment. The trial, beginning in May 2002, featured extensive testimony about the Skakel family dynamics, the social pressures of adolescent relationships in wealthy enclaves, and the alleged confessions that prosecutors argued demonstrated Michael's guilty conscience, while defense attorney Mickey Sherman mounted an aggressive attack on the reliability of treatment program witnesses and the credibility of investigators who had focused on Michael after decades of pursuing other theories. On June 7, 2002, the jury convicted Skakel of murder, sentencing him to 20 years to life in prison, a verdict that the Moxley family received with relief, though Martha's mother Dorothy noted that no punishment could restore what had been taken from them. The conviction was subsequently overturned in 2013 when the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled that Skakel's original trial attorney had failed to adequately investigate an alibi defense involving a nearby youth center where Skakel claimed to have been viewing a Monty Python movie at the time of the murder, a finding of ineffective assistance of counsel that vacated the conviction and ordered a new trial. However, in 2016, the state's highest court reversed this decision in a sharply divided ruling, reinstating the conviction, only to have the United States Supreme Court decline review in 2018, leaving Skakel to pursue additional state court challenges that continued as of 2024 with no final resolution to the case's legal status. The Martha Moxley murder remains one of the most controversial convictions in American criminal history, its legitimacy debated by legal scholars who question whether a conviction based primarily on decades-old treatment program confessions, without physical evidence linking Skakel to the crime scene, can satisfy due process requirements, while others argue that the Skakel family's wealth has enabled legal maneuvering unavailable to ordinary defendants and that the evidence of guilt is stronger than appellate courts have acknowledged. For Greenwich, Connecticut, the case shattered the community's self-image as a haven from urban crime, exposing the capacity for violence even in exclusive environments and the distorting effects of wealth and political connections on criminal justice administration. The Moxley family, particularly Dorothy, who died in 2019 after 44 years of seeking justice for her daughter, became symbols of persistence in victim advocacy. Their willingness to challenge powerful interests inspiring other families of murdered children to continue demanding accountability regardless of the social status of potential suspects. Whether Michael Skakel ultimately serves his sentence or secures exoneration, the Martha Moxley case has fundamentally shaped American understanding of how privilege can influence criminal investigations and how cold case prosecution can succeed through institutional commitment to revisiting assumptions that protected influential suspects from appropriate scrutiny. Number 2. The 1989 murder of Angela Samota, a 23-year-old Southern Methodist University student whose case was solved through the extraordinary persistence of her friend and fellow student Sheila Wysocki, who transformed personal grief into professional investigation and achieved justice that formal law enforcement channels had failed to deliver for over 2 decades. On October 12, 1989, Angela Samota, a computer science major and cheerleader at SMU, spent the evening with friends before returning alone to her off-campus apartment in Dallas, Texas, where sometime after midnight she was attacked by an intruder who sexually assaulted and stabbed her repeatedly in a brutal assault that suggested both opportunistic burglary and targeted violence, the killer leaving behind biological evidence but no immediate leads to his identity. The initial investigation developed a prime suspect in Russell Buchanan, a man who had been seen near Samota's apartment and who had called her earlier that evening. Though detectives could not establish physical evidence linking him to the crime scene, and the case gradually went cold despite periodic reviews and the continued anguish of Samota's family, particularly her mother, who maintained contact with the Dallas Police Department and preserved her daughter's belongings in hopes of eventual resolution. Sheila Wysocki, who had been Samota's roommate and closest friend, was particularly devastated by the murder, experiencing years of depression, substance abuse, and failed relationships that she attributed to unresolved trauma from the violent death of her friend and her frustration with the failed investigation, until a spiritual experience in 2004 convinced her that Angela was communicating from beyond death, urging her to pursue the case that official channels had abandoned. Whether interpreted as genuine supernatural communication or the emergence of repressed determination, this experience catalyzed Wysocki's transformation from grieving friend to amateur investigator, a role for which she had no training but possessed unique advantages, including personal knowledge of Angela's social circle, established relationships with surviving witnesses, and an emotional investment that professional investigators, however dedicated, could not replicate. Wysocki began by reconstructing the case from original police files, many of which she obtained through persistent public records requests and appeals to detectives who recognized her commitment, discovering that evidence had been improperly stored, leads inadequately pursued, and suspects eliminated based on superficial assessments that did not withstand careful review. She identified Russell Buchanan as a still viable suspect, locating his current residence in New Mexico and developing circumstantial evidence suggesting his presence in Dallas on the night of the murder, though she lacked the authority to compel interviews or obtain DNA samples that could confirm or exclude his involvement. Her breakthrough came through relationship building with Dallas cold case detectives who, impressed by her thorough preparation and respectful approach, agreed to resubmit biological evidence for advanced DNA testing that had not been available in 1989, discovering that the original sample, though degraded, could yield a partial profile suitable for comparison with known suspects. When Buchanan's DNA was obtained through a discarded cigarette and compared to the crime scene evidence, the match confirmed his identity as Angela Samota's killer with scientific certainty, leading to his arrest in 2009. 20 years after the murder, he had apparently believed he had escaped through the passage of time and the incompetence of the original investigation. The trial, conducted in 2010, featured testimony from Wysocki about her investigation, though defense attorneys successfully limited this testimony to factual matters rather than her spiritual motivations. Forensic evidence regarding the DNA match and testimony from witnesses who placed Buchanan in proximity to Samota on the night of her death and described his unusual interest in her in the days preceding the attack. On June 18, 2010, a jury convicted Buchanan of capital murder, sentencing him to life imprisonment, a verdict that Wysocki received with mixed emotions. Relief that Angela's killer had been identified and punished, but continued frustration that the justice system had required a private citizen to accomplish what properly funded and administered law enforcement should have achieved. The case generated significant media attention focused on Wysocki's role, with television programs and magazine articles celebrating her persistence while raising uncomfortable questions about why such extraordinary individual effort was necessary to resolve a case with clear physical evidence and identifiable suspects. Wysocki subsequently became a professional private investigator, founding without warning private investigations and applying her methodology to other cold cases, though she has emphasized that citizen investigation should complement rather than replace professional law enforcement, and has advocated for improved cold case units and victim family services that can prevent the isolation and frustration she experienced. The Angela Samota murder demonstrated both the potential for determined individuals to advance justice and the systemic failures that make such intervention necessary, highlighting how budget constraints, personnel turnover, and institutional inertia can allow solvable cases to languish indefinitely without external pressure. For the true crime genre, Wysocki's story has become a touchstone for discussions of victim advocacy and citizen investigation, inspiring both admiration for her achievement and cautionary analysis of the risks untrained individuals face when pursuing dangerous suspects, while for Dallas law enforcement, the case prompted internal reviews of cold case procedures and evidence preservation protocols designed to prevent similar failures in future investigations. Number 1. The 1980 murder of Helene Przezinski, a 21-year-old journalism student interning at a Denver radio station, whose case was solved through genetic genealogy 40 years after her death, demonstrating the revolutionary impact of this technology on cold case investigation and providing a template for resolving countless similar crimes. On January 16, 1980, Helene Przezinski, a senior at Wheaton College in Massachusetts, had traveled to Denver for a semester internship at KHOWAM Radio, sharing an apartment with her aunt in Englewood while gaining professional experience that would launch her anticipated career in broadcast journalism, a field she had chosen for its potential to illuminate important stories and serve communities through information dissemination. After completing her shift, she took a bus to her aunt's neighborhood but exited one stop early, perhaps to walk the remaining distance in the Colorado evening. A minor miscalculation that placed her in the path of Curtis Allen White, a 19-year-old with an extensive criminal history including prior sexual offenses who had been prowling the area seeking victims, identifying Przezinski as she walked alone through the residential streets. White abducted Przezinski at knife point, forced her into his vehicle, drove to a secluded field, sexually assaulted her, and stabbed her repeatedly before leaving her body where it was discovered the following morning by a passerby. the violence of the attack and the randomness of victim selection making this a particularly frightening crime for the Denver community and initially suggesting the work of a serial offender whose capture was essential to preventing additional deaths. The investigation immediately identified physical evidence, including semen that provided a complete DNA profile once that technology became available in the 1990s. Though extensive database searching produced no matches because White had not been required to submit DNA for his prior offenses committed before such requirements were established, and the case gradually went cold despite periodic reviews and advances in forensic technology that maintained the evidence's viability for future testing. The resolution came in 2020 when the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, participating in a systematic review of cold cases suitable for genetic genealogy analysis, submitted Przinsky's case to United Data Connect, a Colorado company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy that had been founded by scientists and investigators specifically to apply these methods to unsolved crimes. Genetic genealogists constructed a family tree from distant relatives in GEDmatch and other databases, identifying Curtis Allen White as the likely perpetrator through a process that required months of careful analysis to navigate complex family relationships and eliminate alternative candidates. Though White himself had died in 2020, months before the identification, from causes unrelated to the investigation. The identification was confirmed through DNA comparison with White's surviving family members, achieving scientific certainty that he had been responsible for Przinsky's murder, though the timing meant that no criminal prosecution was possible and the legal resolution was limited to the formal closing of the case with a finding of probable cause had White survived. The announcement on January 16, 2020, exactly 40 years after Przinsky's murder, brought closure to her surviving siblings, particularly her sister who had maintained contact with investigators and preserved family memory of Helene's ambitions and character. Though they expressed mixed emotions about the perpetrator's escape from earthly accountability through death, a common frustration in cold case resolutions where the passage of time eliminates the possibility of trial and punishment. The Przinsky case exemplifies several important themes in contemporary cold case investigation. The transformative potential of genetic genealogy in identifying perpetrators who have escaped detection through conventional methods, the importance of evidence preservation across decades of technological change, the value of institutional commitment to reviewing cold cases as new methods become available, and the emotional complexity of resolution when perpetrators have died or aged beyond meaningful punishment. For law enforcement, the case provided validation of investment in genetic genealogy capabilities and encouraged expansion of such programs, while for the true crime community, it reinforced optimism that even the oldest cases with biological evidence can yield to persistent application of advancing science. Helene Przinsky's murder, once a frightening but ultimately unsolved crime that exemplified the random violence possible in American communities, has become instead a story of technological triumph and institutional persistence, her name associated with the progress that has transformed cold case investigation in the 21st century, and the hope that similar methods will eventually resolve countless other cases awaiting scientific developments that can identify perpetrators and provide answers to grieving families who have maintained faith across decades that justice, however delayed, remains possible.